all essay classes for today, all the Torah that was learned, was done in the memory of Mr. Stanley Chera A, who passed away recently, and it was a tremendous, tremendous loss to our community. B'ezras Hashem, all the Torah that we have studied today in commemoration of Yom Haasmaut should bring some comfort and nacha to the families. Our topic today is going to be specifically on Hebron. And before we get to Hebron, I just want to point out where Hebron lies in relation to other cities in Israel. So there are considered 4 holy cities of Israel: Yerushalayim, Sfat, Safed, Tiberia, and Hebron, which we're going to focus on today. And if you were to ask, which would be a good question, what makes a city a holy city in Israel? Essentially, there are 3, so to speak, criteria, right? Number 1, they all have religious sites, the Kotel, Marat HaMachpelah, so on and so forth. They retain Jewish presence in these cities constantly, continually throughout the ages, no matter what, which we're going to see was the case with Hebron. And there are very unique and important burial spots in these cities that of course also you're familiar with, Marat HaMachpelah. So let's look at the city of Hebron. The name Hebron, as well as the Arabic name Al-Khalil, both mean essentially the same thing. Hebron from the word Haber, friend, most likely referring to Avraham Avinu, who befriended and had a very good reputation with the natives of the land. And because of that, he was able to purchase a spot for his wife Rivka, which was Ma'arat HaMachpelah. So Al-Khalil, Hebron, from Lashon Haver, referring to Avraham Avinu. Now you can see over here, this image that I put over here is a little bit strange. This is the city logo of Hebron. This is their symbol. And the reason this is their symbol is because there are over 200,000 Arabs that live in Hebron. There are approximately 1,000 Jews who live in Hebron. 200,000 to 1,000 Jews. It is extremely predominantly Arab. And hopefully this class will give us an appreciation for the history and the Jewish continuity in Hebron, that even though we're so little there, it is so important to appreciate the city and to continue to go there and to build it and to strengthen it up. So we're going to start off seeing Hebron through the Tanach. We'll start off obviously with Avraham Avinu. Avraham, while he was recovering from his Brit Milah, the 3rd day he invited guests over. He ran over to them in order to welcome them, to invite them in. But that's not the only time that Avraham ran that day. It also says, Ve'el habakar ratz Avraham, which is a little bit strange why he would run after the bakar. And that leads the Midrash to explain that the lamb ran away from Avraham as he was trying to prepare it for his guests. And where did it run to? It ran all the way to Hebron, all the way to Kiryat Arba, and it hid in one of the many different caves in that area. And Avraham followed it, and as he goes into the cave, he sees a tremendous fire which would block anyone from really going into the cave. And all of a sudden the fire subsides. Avraham enters and smells this unbelievable fragrance, and he steps forward and he sees the kevarim, the burial spots of Adam and Chava, and he realizes essentially that he is at the gate, the entrance of Gan Eden. Now this midrash, which is very much elaborated in the Zohar, essentially explains why Avraham Avinu became fixated, so determined and adamant to locate, to be in this specific location and to buy this burial ground for his wife. I see Elliot Sasson posted a fantastic comment, similar to Moshe running after a sheep and sees the burning bush. Unbelievable, Elliot, as usual. I think that this midrash is playing off of the Moshe story because it's not written in the text. I think it's trying to link Avraham Avinu with Ma'arat HaMachpelah and Moshe Rabbeinu with Har Sinai, those 2 very significant places, as well as those 2 very significant people. So Abraham becomes fixated with this. And as you all know, right, Abraham ends up buying that location. What's interesting is that the word kever means both grave and womb, like a mother's womb. And as Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, who lives very close to Hebron, points out, such a deep concept, he explains that the etymological connection between a grave and a womb is because the grave is also the womb. The past is the mother to the future, that he says. You can kind of dwell on that statement for a while, but I interpret that to mean that just like the womb brings forth life and is the origin, so too the grave is what connects all future generations and establishes essentially a heritage, which is exactly what happens with Ma'arat HaMachpelah in Hebron. Probably the first and last time ever that a Jew offers to buy something for full price. Abraham does not haggle. He does not try to lower the price. He wants to buy Ma'arat HaMachpelah bechesef maleh, full price. He could have gotten it even for free, but he did not want to take a gift. He wanted to own it. He wanted the deed to the land, and he wanted, no doubt, for everyone to absolutely understand that this was his land and no one was taking it away from him, which is so interesting from the fact that the land is so disputed for us even today. According to some interpretations, this is Abraham's 10th and final test, that even though Borei Olam promised Avraham Avinu the entire land of Israel, he had to go and buy land in Eretz Yisrael. Why did he have to buy it? Hashem promised him. But that was one of the tests that Avraham had to go through. He did it respectfully. He didn't complain. And it was an elaborate negotiation, but he did it out of love for his wife and for the land of Israel. Moving on to Yaakov Aveeno, the pasuk says, Vayitzav otam, Yaakov commands his sons, and specifically Yosef. He says, I'm about to pass away. I want you to bury me in the same location that Abraham and Sarah and Yitzhak and Rivka were buried. And according to a professor, Leon Cass, who has unbelievable interpretations on specifically Bereshit, he says that Israel's memory and our connection to the land happens to be very, very much linked to Ma'arat HaMachpelah, and that is specifically why Yaakov Aveeno wanted to be buried there, because he knew Bnei Israel, Am Yisrael, the people were going to be in exile. He wanted them to have a connection to the land of Israel. So he wanted to be buried there, and that's which essentially connected the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael for 400 years in exile. And that is exactly what happens in Sefer B'Midbar, when in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu, the spies are sent, and Kalev ben Yefuneh, as well as the other spies, their first stop essentially, when they enter in the land while they're spying, is Vayalu Banegev Vayavo ad Hebron. They reach Hebron. Why Hebron? Why is that mentioned? Simply because that is the only Jewish identifiable location. That is what they know, because Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov were buried there, which is extremely significant. Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, Ma'arat HaMachpelah, connects us to the land of Israel. It is our heritage, and that continues on even to our day. It's what connects us to the land of Israel. It is our heritage. But the importance and significance of Hebron continues and grows even further. David HaMelech was king in Hebron for 7 years. While he was only king of Yehudah, 7 of those years was of Hebron, and then he moves on and becomes the king over all of Israel, setting his capital in Yerushalayim for 33 years. Hebron and Yerushalayim are very much linked. Geographically, spiritually, Hebron and Yerushalayim have a lot of connections. David HaMelech is one of them, but another connection is probably my absolute favorite. I had the zechut of teaching in Yeshivat Barkai. Not many people know what the word Barkai really means. The word Barkai comes from a Mishnah in Masechet Yomah, in which essentially the Mishnah is discussing when is the earliest time that they could start bringing the first korban in the morning. And the conclusion is that once the sun rises and there is light, then you could start bringing the korban. Now, the question really is, how much light do you need? And the answer is that as long as from Jerusalem you can see Hebron lit up. That is the earliest time that you could start bringing the korbanot. And there was a designated person that would stand on the watchtower. He would look over the horizon and see. As soon as he could see Hebron in the morning, he would yell Barkai, which means it's light. The sun is out there, which is why the symbol of Yeshivat Barkai is that ray of light. Going back to the Mishnah, another connection between Hebron and Yerushalayim. We're moving on from the biblical period that mentions and stresses Hebron. And it doesn't end there. Hebron was something very significant. Even in the times of the Maccabim, when they were trying to reconquer and retake much of Eretz Yisrael, in the book of Maccabees, it stresses that they went forth and they attacked different areas, and specifically they were able to reconquer Hebron. There wasn't even one moment in which Hebron wasn't occupied and taken care of by the Jewish people. The Maccabees found it to be an absolutely vital and important spot in order to make sure that it's conquered. And now we'll see Hebron through the Middle Ages. There's tremendous amount of literature and details of Hebron all the way up through the Middle Ages. We're going to kind of skip through it, but there's a lot of interesting things specifically through the Middle Ages. So Harambam, who was definitely not a proponent for visiting graves, incredibly testifies how he went to Hebron, made an incredibly difficult journey to get there, and prayed at Ma'arat HaMachpelah, the cave of our forefathers. And he explains in a letter that he wrote describing his experience how incredibly emotional it was for him. And in commemoration of the day that he made it to Hebron, to Ma'arat HaMachpelah, he celebrated that same date every single year with food and with wine, out of rejoicing from the fact that he had reached Hebron and seen Ma'arat HaMachpelah. Now, as I mentioned, Harambam was not a supporter of praying at graves, but for Harambam, I would like to suggest it wasn't a matter of praying to dead bodies. It was something that we mentioned before. It's the importance of our link to Eretz Yisrael. It is our parents, our forefathers, Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, who are buried there, and we are their descendants. And this is essentially our claim to that land. The Torah is our claim to that land, that Hashem promised it to us, but it is also that familial, that heritage that we come and we say, well, listen, we belong there. This is our land. Our forefathers have been there, and to go there connects us to the land. And it's an incredibly emotional thing that we need to hold very dear and very important, as Harambam did. I want to share some other rabbis who lived and spent some time in Hebron. Very apropos to our situation, there was a terrible, terrible disease that broke out in Hebron in 1619. Now you could see on your screen, it's a pizmon, one of the bakashot from Rabbi Israel Najara. Hefez is saying that your great-grandfather wrote that book. Yes, it's a very well-known book. This is the Shiru Shvacha, the red book. This is one of the bakashot, one of the more well-known bakashot, Yaribon Alam Almaya, which was written by Rabbi Israel Najara, as you can see through the siman over here. So he happened to have started off living in Sfat, in Safed, and then he moved down to Hebron, and he had to leave Hebron. And we have a lot of literature how the Jews of Hebron in 1619 had to leave because there was essentially their version of coronavirus, essentially a plague, a disease that was causing tremendous harm, and many of the inhabitants had to leave because they were dying from this disease. On that note, I can't testify to the legitimacy of this story, but there's a famous story that says that only 9 Jews remained behind in 1619 when this plague broke out. And on Yom Kippur, there were only 9 of them. They were in the synagogue, and they were waiting for a minyan, but they didn't have a minyan. They were just 9. And they were very upset. It was Yom Kippur. And all of a sudden, a man just walked in and joined them for the minyan. They had never seen the man before in their entire lives. And after the prayers, he left, and they had never seen him again. And the rumor started to spread that he was Avraham Aveeno himself, And from that day on, that synagogue in Hebron was called the Avraham Avinu Synagogue. Now, again, it's quite a fantastic story. I can't tell the legitimacy of it, but despite that fact, it's certainly miraculous that they stayed behind. They cared for Hebron even though there was a disease going on, and they remained there. They always wanted to maintain a Jewish presence in Hebron, and they were so steadfast in that goal. Moving on to Hebron in the 18 and 1900s. You can see over here a picture of Hebron in the 1900s. Now, there were many Chachamim that lived in Hebron at that time. One of them was Rabbi Eliyahu Mani, who was a Mikubal, and there are fantastic, miraculous stories that are told about him, that he was able to cure people from blindness, and he was the chief rabbi then. The Ben Ish Chai visited Hebron and stayed there for a while, and he ended up becoming a supporter. He raised money in order to support the people that lived in Hebron. And after Rabbi Eliyahu Mani passed away, the Stei Hamed, who was a tremendous Chacham, Rabbi Chaim Hizkiah Medini, ended up becoming in 1901 the chief rabbi of Hebron. The scholarship and the Chachamim that lived in Hebron were always very prestigious. It was a hashuv place to be. And moving on, in between 1893 and 1909, there were several very wealthy Baghdadi Jews who ended up buying this property, which is the Beit Hadassah Hospital in Hebron. And they made it into a hospital, a very famous hospital. Interestingly, Moses Montefiore was there years before him, and he tried to buy it from that same Arab, but the price that he quoted was so high, even for Montefiore, that he wasn't able to buy it. Later on, these Baghdadi Jews bought it, and they built the community there, and they were responsible for supporting and building the community there. And Moses Montefiore set up essentially a census in 1855, in which he counted and tried to figure out exactly how many Jews were there in Hebron. And we have very clear and accurate records of the Jews that were there. How many of them were single, how many of them were married, how many children were in each home, which areas that they lived in. It was a very detailed census. And basically what we see is that there were about 400 Jews that were living in Hebron in the late 1800s. 249 of them were Sephardic and 142 of them were Ashkenazi. They were the minority. And I tell you this because there's a very interesting documentation about this specifically, because they were living in close quarters, the Sephardim and Ashkenazim in Hebron. And the communities, although separate, were starting to become more comfortable with one another. And the idea and the topics of intermarrying within one another, the Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities, started to become more of a reality. And we have very interesting documentation of the Sephardic men of that community in the 1800s who would complain and would sort of deny marrying the Ashkenazi women because they weren't speaking Spanish, and they were refusing to cook Sephardic food. This is documented in letters and in different accounts from that time. And there are also documents of how Ashkenazi men were very much favoring marrying Sephardic women. And they explain how the Sephardic women made great housewives and how they were great cooks. And the Ashkenazi men wanted to marry the Sephardic women, but the Ashkenazi women didn't really want to marry the Sephardic men, and the Sephardic men didn't want to marry the Ashkenazi women. The Sephardic men were considered not religious enough, or they were too strict at home. Interpret that however you want to interpret it. But those are very interesting records that we have from Hebron in the late 1800s. The year 1929 is probably one of the saddest days in Hebron's history. There was a terrible and brutal massacre that took place in Hebron. 69 Jews were killed, brutally murdered by their Arab neighbors, their friends. Essentially, these were their friends. And Arab uprisings were becoming intense. There were rumors that Israel was trying to conquer Jerusalem. That Jews were trying to conquer Jerusalem and conquer Har HaBayit in 1929, and revolts were getting out of hand. And a once very peaceful Hebron was completely destroyed, the Jewish life there. And we have testimonies of Jews that were describing the aftermath of it. One specific boy whose name was Chaim Bajayo, and the Bajayo family was very well known. They were in Hebron for generations. And we have testimonies of him saying that up until 1929, they lived very happily with the Arabs in Hebron. Up until that very last day, they were friendly, they were communicating with one another, they were trading with one another, and all of a sudden, they just massacred completely out of the blue the Jews in Hebron. And we have another testimony that says that the Arabs were a very friendly people to us. We lived very well with them in Hebron, and everything changed in 1929. It was a tremendously sad day. Almost every single Jew was sent to exile, kicked out of Hebron. There might have been one or two that were left there, that stayed there just to maintain a presence. And essentially everyone else was exiled. And that leads to Hebron in the modern day. So Hebron was essentially recaptured in 1967 in the Six-Day War. And the story is incredible. Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who was a leader and a rabbi in the Israeli army at that time, was instrumental in the recapturing of Jerusalem. After they get to Jerusalem, he heads with many troops to Hebron. And just the day before, the Arab leaders of Hebron, they gather up together and they want to discuss, should we resist or should we surrender? The sheikh, the head at that time in Hebron, was named Sheikh Ali Jabari. All of those of you who are watching Fauda in your spare time in quarantine, yes, Jabari is the main bad guy in Fauda season 3. And I believe that he was named after this sheikh, Sheikh Ali Jabari, the mayor of Hebron. And the mayor of Hebron is sitting there with all of his council trying to decide what should we do. And he ends up deciding to surrender even before the Jewish forces come in. And it seems as though the reason why he surrenders is because his family were the main participants in the 1929 massacre. And he was very afraid for his life that if the Jews come in, that they will come and seek revenge on him. And he ends up leading the surrender of Hebron, and Hebron is captured. And this following picture that I'm going to show you is the most unbelievable picture. I'm not sure if you can see this wedding that's taking place in Hebron just 1 week after it is conquered. And the wedding is taking place outside. It's the first wedding in Hebron after 38 years. The groom was a soldier. His name was Meir Broza. He was one of the first soldiers to re-enter Hebron in 1967. And he got married to a woman named Rachel Meyuchas, whose parents were exiled from Hebron years earlier in 1929. And hundreds of Israelis come to Hebron to celebrate this wedding of an incredible union, and they hold it outside. And the chuppah, as you can see, is being supported by 4 guns that are mounted on top of jeeps. And this is a picture of a wedding that took place in 1967, the first wedding after 38 years of Jews not having a strong, there was a presence, but not a strong presence in Hebron. And the joy and the celebration in 1967 was tremendous. I think there were maybe 8 weddings of soldiers that took place in Hebron by Ma'at HaMachpelah in 1967. And there's the groom and the kala. Now, getting more to the modern time, the 2 people that you see over here are Rabbi Moshe and Miriam Levinger. I had the zechut of studying with Rabbi Moshe Levinger's grandson in Israel, and my good friend Mickey Abraham was his Harutah. These 2 people were the founders of modern-day Hebron. In 1967, the stories that you could tell about these 2 people are tremendous. His wife, Miriam, actually grew up in Brooklyn. She was American. She married him and moved to Israel. And essentially what happened was that in 1968, there wasn't too much settling in Hebron. And this Rabbi Moshe Levinger decided that he wanted to do something. He appealed to different politicians. They weren't supporting him. They weren't helping him. So he decided to take it upon himself And different government authorities basically told him that they would close one eye. They're not going to support him, but they're not going to stop him. So what did he do? Coming up to Pesach, he goes to a hotel in Hebron. And he goes to the hotel owner and poses as a non-Jew. He poses as, I think, a Swedish tourist. And he goes to the owner of the hotel and he says, I want to rent out as many rooms as you can. And he says, listen, the whole hotel, it's not really, there's not much business. You can rent out the whole hotel. So he rents out every single room indefinitely. He pays a tremendous sum of money to rent out this hotel. And the Levingers essentially moved into this hotel, and they brought their 4 children with them. They brought a refrigerator. They brought a washing machine. They put up mezuzot. They made the kitchens kosher. They had no intention of leaving. And that Pesach, they celebrated with about 60 to 80 people in and out in that hotel. And a quote from Rabbi Levinger is, we never told anyone that we were only going for Pesach. And he stayed there. And he essentially established and set up the modern Jewish community in Hebron, which was demolished in 1929. In 1968, he started to rebuild it. And that rebuilding of Hebron was very much supported and helped in only about 10 years ago by Morris Abraham. And I'm gonna start to unshare the screen somewhat. I'm not sure if Morris is here. Let's see, is he here? I don't know if I see him. I see Joseph Abraham. Joe, are you there?
Yes. Yeah, I'm here.
How's it going, Joe? So I just, I wanna just share the tremendous story. I can't really do it justice, but Morris Abraham and his family, they put a tremendous amount of money and dedication and risk into purchasing property in order to support the establishment in Hebron. And they purchased and they bought land, a huge building, which is called Beit HaShalom, not far from Ma'arat HaMachpelah. It's circled over there. This building, Beit HaShalom, they bought. I don't want to really say the story because I cannot do it justice. So if either Morris Abraham wants to say the story or I'll play the YouTube clip in which he describes it, we'll end off the class with that. And I'm sure that you'll very much enjoy the story. It is an absolute inspiration. It's a tremendous zechut that we have them in the community, that they've done so much for the city. And Bezrat Hashem, hopefully we can follow in their footsteps and support this tremendous city, which we have so much history behind. From Avraham Avinu to Mishpahat Avraham, Hebron was never lost amongst the Jewish people. Mr. Abraham, you there?
Hi, Rabbi, I'm here. You did a beautiful job on the history of Hebron. And I would love to share the story with you, but now is really not the time because the story is 15 years in the making. And God willing, one day we'll have a documentary on it. But if you'd like, play the clip that you prepared in lieu of me. But thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share the screen for this YouTube video. All of you who